first of our visiting scholars lecture series, which Adam Dahl is visiting all the way from Thompson Hall.
Very far.
Very far in many ways. Being that anthropology is in Macro Hall, it's, we envy them in Thompson. You all have new glass doors.
Oh, yeah, that's right. But nothing else is new. We got the doors, though.
There's some new tables and chairs.
That's true. It's accessible.
It's a facade. It's okay. It's okay. So Adam is Dr. Dahl is an assistant professor of political science here at UMass Amherst, sorry. His research and teaching interests are in American political thought, democratic theory, the politics of race and indigeneity, and political theories of empire and colonialism. His first book, Empire of the People, Settler Colonialism and the Foundations of Modern Democratic Thought, was released in 2018 and examines the constitutive role of settler colonialism in shaping modern norms of democratic legitimacy. He is currently at work on a book-length project tentatively titled, and I understand the tentative,
yeah.
Transnational Democracy in the Americas, which explores the interconnected dynamics of internationalism, anti-imperialism, and transnational citizenship in the American democratic tradition. And we've gained a lot from having Adam as a part of our conversations about Du Bois's role in a lot of the work. So we're really glad that Adam has come across the campus, not really, just come next to us and shared it with us. And he is one of two of our first, since the Mellon grant, of us having UMass faculty. We used to many moons ago,
Did
but
that happen more?
a long time ago when we had less money. So let's welcome Dr. Dahl and look forward to his talk.
First, I wanted to say thanks everyone for being here, especially since, as I understand, I'm competing for your time with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, which apparently I never thought I'd have to say, but here I am. So thanks for being here. So yeah, so just a little bit of background about this research. My interest in Du Bois started out with one chapter in this larger book that Professor Baptiste was talking about. And as I've been in the archives, it's now slowly morphing into a book about Du Bois, so I'm still trying to figure this whole thing out. I think one of the great things about being here, but also one of the difficult things about having all of this wealth of information regarding Du Bois here, is that a simple little chapter on Du Bois can very quickly balloon, I don't want to say out of control, but out of control in an actually quite productive and positive way, I'd say. So what I want to talk about today is what I see as, and I think what many people would certainly argue, is probably the defining feature of Du Bois's career in the 1940s. And that was his participation at the United Nations Conference on International Organization from April to June of 1945. And I'll refer to this subsequently as the San Francisco Conference. So Du Bois attended the conference as a consultant for the United States delegation, and he was specifically representing the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples, the NAACP. His work at the conference marked his new position with the NAACP as Director of Special Research, which is everybody can see this, which is a position that he held from September 1st, 1944 to December of 1948, when he finally resigned. It's also important to note here that this was a position that he had accepted after estrangement and his ultimate resignation from the organization a decade earlier in 1934. And I handed out, I don't know if anybody needs a copy, I handed out this timeline that I created with the help of my research assistant, Benjamin Nolan, who was also a fellow here a summer or two ago. And so we've kind of tried to piece together what Du Bois's career looked like in the 1940s. This certainly isn't everything, but I think it gives you a pretty good picture of the just wealth of different kinds of activities that he was engaged in. I mean, he was going to meet with State Department officials. I mean, it was quite extensive and quite impressive. There's some interesting stories that we could certainly go into there. I'm not going to go through this, but I just wanted to put this out there just to give you a sense, to give you at least a small snapshot of what he was actually up to in the 1940s. But one of his central reasons for resigning from the NAACP in 1934 was what he thought of as the organization's complete inattention to the transnational and global dimensions of the race problem in the United States. He said they will have nothing to do with Africa or the Negroes outside of the United States, and I could not agree with them. So his return to the NAACP a decade later in 1944 came at an unusual but also somewhat auspicious moment in the history of the organization, when, like the larger Afro-American community, it was, in Gerald Horne's words, avowedly anti-colonialist and anti-imperialist. And in fact, one of Du Bois's primary duties with the NAACP was to prepare material, quote, to be presented on behalf of the American Negro and the colored peoples of the world to the Peace Conference or the Peace Conferences. And those words come directly from the 1944 NAACP board meeting that initially authorized Walter White, the secretary of the organization, to extend the offer to Du Bois. So one of the centerpieces of Du Bois's efforts here in the 1940s, can you all, did your computer freeze, or?
Will you try to see it?
Now, let's see. There we go, got it, perfect. So one of the defining, one of the central efforts of his work in the 1940s here was his publication of Colonial Democracy, Colonies, and Peace, which came out with Harcourt and Brace in 1945. And this book was really a reaction to the failure of the Dumbarton Oaks Conference in 1944 to adequately deal with the problems of colonialism in the colonies in the new post-war global order. So the Dumbarton Oaks Conference, which was held right outside of Georgetown in Washington, D.C., basically laid the initial framework under which the United Nations founding charter would be discussed during the San Francisco conference. And Du Bois wasn't at that conference, but he did attend a briefing with the U.S. State Department on the conference, and he basically stood up and interrupted the conference to ask what of the colonies in this new post-war order, and the officials at the meeting said, we'll get to that later. And so this was his entire sort of effort during this period, was that we need to deal with the problem of colonialism, otherwise the entire project of world peace and global governance is going to be for nothing, and it's not going to be successful. And the reason for this was that one of his central arguments here was that competition among European imperial powers for possession of colonies was the root cause of World War I and World War II. Right? So without dealing with the problem of colonialism, right, any effort at creating a framework for world peace and international cooperation was going to be for naught. Right? So in other words, world peace and international global governance required a systematic vision of decolonization that would restore democratic self-rule to the colonies. One of Du Bois's other, though much less known efforts here, and I would say also much less appreciated efforts at highlighting the colonial question in the 1940s, involved his central role organizing what he called the Colonial Conference, which was held April 6th to the 7th, 1945 at the Schoenberg Library in Harlem, New York. Prior to the conference, Du Bois had sent invitations to political and intellectual leaders living around and near New York to serve as representatives of the colonies themselves, as representatives of colonial powers, and finally as representatives of philanthropic and religious organizations who were dealing with colonial policy. So he intended the conference less as a discussion of theory and opinion, and much more as a fact-finding mission. For him, it was about finding data and information to get a complete picture of the present and future conditions of colonial peoples throughout the world. He also, in his invitations, requested that participants bring with them statements, resolutions, petitions, and manifestos that various anti-colonial movements have made since World War I. And his ultimate intention out of this conference was to publish these manifestos and petitions and all this information that they had collected in a volume that he was going to title Colonial Demand for Freedom and Democracy in the 20th Century. And he had ultimately pitched this volume to the Macmillan Company to publish, and they responded with some qualified interest, but said that they wanted to see a full version of the manuscript before they could make a decision on it. And there's a bit of a backstory here that I can go into in the Q&A, but ultimately Du Bois never produced the manuscript, and so nothing ever came of the volume, at least as far as I've been able to tell so far. But all of that said, I do think that this idea, sorry, I must have missed a slide here, that this idea for this volume, Colonial Demand for Democracy and Freedom in the 20th Century, says something very important about what Du Bois saw as his own efforts and objectives in his work with the NAACP in the 1940s. What these efforts indicate to me is that going into the San Francisco Conference, Du Bois was foremost concerned with representing the unified voice of colonial peoples for democratic self-rule and freedom from colonial domination. In other words, Du Bois saw himself as a kind of global representative of colonial peoples before these newly emerging institutions of world democracy and global governance. But in claiming here to represent this colonial demand for democracy and freedom, Du Bois had to clearly mark out what he meant by colonial peoples and colonial status. In other words, in defining or claiming to represent colonial peoples, Du Bois ran into both I'd say a theoretical and a practical problem. And that problem was simply this, that there was no global constituency called colonial peoples prior to his active representation. There were colonial peoples in Ceylon, in French Indonesia, in Nigeria or Algeria or the Philippines or Puerto Rico. But the idea that all of these people might be said to face a shared set of conditions that could be thought of as comprising this global system of imperial rule was by no means straightforward or obvious. Right? And so we get a sense of this problem of what it means to represent colonial peoples, which surfaces in, to me, an incredibly intriguing exchange that Du Bois had with one of the people that he invited to the Colonial Conference. And that was the controversial anti-fundamentalist Baptist minister, Harry Emerson Fosdick, who Du Bois greatly admired and was a prominent anti-racist member, an outspoken anti-racist member of the clergy at the time. In response to Du Bois's invitation, Fosdick said that his use of the word colony evades ordinary meaning of the term. He said, "I cannot get even the dimmest idea as to what you mean by a colony." And he went on to say to Du Bois that I haven't the faintest glimmer of a conception concerning what your letter means, right? So not particularly encouraging words coming from somebody who Du Bois had clearly admired. Du Bois responded with about 2 sentences and enclosed this list of demographic data to Fosdick, which on the left is, it's not labeled, but on the left here is demographic population statistics, and then on the right here is land by square miles, and so you can do the math, but this adds up to 750 million. And so that's important. So Du Bois says, he just includes this list of demographic data and says that he wants Fosdick to look at this, quote, "in order that you may realize that 750 million people live on this earth in colonies which have rights which no white nation is bound to respect." I love that quote because I love the way he uses you'll notice if you've ever read Dred Scott v. Sanford, he's actually using Justice Taney's language, but to talk about this sort of global set of dynamics. So I find that incredibly interesting. But what we see with Fosdick's own response to all of this was that there was no singular constituency to represent before the institutions of global democracy, right? He couldn't get this idea of what a colonial peoples meant. So in order to bring colonial demands for freedom and democracy before the United Nations, Du Bois had to first ensure that there was this bounded constituency to represent in the first place, that there was a people out there called colonial peoples. And doing this, I want to suggest and explore here, hinged on clearly defining terms like colonialism, colony, and colonial status. And this task was made all the more difficult by the fact that included in these formal colonial possessions, Du Bois also wanted to include what he called sort of semi-colonial peoples or internally colonized peoples like African Americans within the United States. Right? So it gets incredibly complex. So in this research, I'm interested in how Du Bois navigated this problem of representing and defining colonial peoples. And I've been focusing largely on his unpublished essays and speeches, as well as his correspondence, as we've already seen, to get a deeper sense of how he conceptualizes these terms like colonialism and imperialism, as well as cognates like colony and colonial peoples. I argue that attention to these conceptualizations reveals the specifically transnational and democratic aspects of his political thinking. And specifically, they reflect his goal of connecting domestic racial hierarchies in the United States to colonial and imperial hierarchies abroad. And out of these connections, he hoped to build a transnational democratic majority that could be united in a common program of international action. So, to understand his work in the 1940s, we can get some really important clues in an ultimately unpublished article that he wrote in 1935 called The Pragmatic Program for a Dark Minority. This is a really intriguing paper to me, and it's somewhat enigmatic. We don't know a whole lot about it. From what I've been able to tell, Du Bois originally prepared the paper for a conference at Howard University that was held in April 1935 and convened by the philosopher Alain Locke at Howard. And the primary theme of the conference was called Problems, Programs, and Philosophies of Minority Groups. And Du Bois had presented this paper on a specific panel that was on the topic of tactics and strategies of minority groups. So Du Bois was writing this paper in conversation with others like Alain Locke, Ralph Bunche, on the specific kind of tactics that minority groups struggling for civil rights should employ. In 1938, Du Bois had submitted this paper to the Atlantic Monthly for publication, and they ultimately declined to publish it. There's this weird sort of, you'll notice at the top it says for New Deal, the New Deal book, and I have to look into that a little bit more. I've seen faint references to this book that he was writing on the New Deal, but haven't been able to find a whole lot more about it. So if anybody has any leads here, I'm open to any suggestions. But other than all of this, we don't really know what came of this essay. But what I want to suggest here is that it lays the theoretical foundations for his global political thought in the 1940s. In Pragmatic Program, Du Bois initially started to develop his thesis that racial minorities within a nation are analogous to, on the one hand, formal colonies that are politically dependent on imperial powers, and on the other hand, semi-colonial nations economically dependent on imperial powers. So what he suggests here is that we have really at stake here are three global minority populations. On the one hand, formal colonies who are legally under the control of a foreign power or a foreign government. We have what he calls small nations who are formally independent and free, yet nevertheless face economic dependence on more powerful European nations. And then finally, he says that we have national minorities facing segregation and discrimination within a national political order. Although they face different forms of domination and dependence, these three distinct populations altogether comprise what Du Bois calls constructed minorities. And what he means by that are artificially constructed minorities. So far from natural minorities, the lack of power that constructed minorities face is an artifact of the spatial scale of politics at which they operate. By confining minority demands for economic and political equality within the confined scale of domestic or national politics, colonial powers actually disconnect these demands from one another through a distinct spatial strategy of bifurcating or separating out the international level of politics from the national level of politics. Colonial peoples, then, when understood in isolation from the broader dynamics of imperialism and global capitalism, appear as minorities within discrete nation-states or discrete imperial systems. And as a consequence of this, colonial peoples then lack the means to make necessary connections with each other to develop transnational solidarity. As long as they remain minorities in relation to an imperial mother country or a nation state, they will be unable to exercise political voice. And democracy will remain a segregated endeavor reserved for white European nations. So from this idea of constructive minorities, Du Bois goes on to outline three options here. The first option, he says, is to seek a separate national existence through self-segregation. A second option is to seek eventual inclusion within mother countries through absorption and assimilation into a dominant majority group. And what you'll notice with these first two options, what jumps out to me, is that these two options correspond to what Bernard Boxall and other philosophers have suggested are really the two primary strands of black political thought. On the one hand, a sort of separatist, nationalist strand that seeks self-segregation, and on the other hand, an integrationist strand that seeks inclusion, assimilation, all of these kinds of associated words. And what Du Bois does here is he rejects both of those options. And he suggests that there is in fact a third option. And the problem with these first two options is that none of them really contest the spatial scale of politics, right? They leave that fundamental distinction between the international and the national intact. So for this third option, Du Bois said, the goal is to actually blur the boundaries between the national and the international. And the way to do that is to seek federation, union, and cooperation among the constructed minorities of the world. So by expanding the scope of racial and colonial conflict beyond the nation, constructed minorities would then become a transnational democratic majority. In key respects, Du Bois sought to create a transnational multiracial democracy on a global scale. But one of the central problems here was that global minorities were disconnected from one another. And we see this in this passage from this essay where Du Bois writes, minority groups, colonies, and small nations occupy today an anomalous position in the world. Together they form a major part of the world's population. Separately, they are dominated by majorities who wield political, economic, and social power over them. Ordinarily, they cannot hope to become majorities. That is, if they remain within the national or imperial scale of politics, right? If they raise it to the level of the global or the international, then the entire stakes and the terrain of politics fundamentally changes. So based on this theory of constructive minorities, Du Bois envisions what he calls a new conception of democracy. A democracy of minorities which becomes a reservoir of openly expressed opinions and desires. Du Bois's new conception of democracy here reflects a persistent strand of his democratic thinking, which, as Nicholas Bramell notes, quote, continually tries to make room for the differences it encounters by habitually seeking an enlargement of the whole. What interests me is that Du Bois seeks to enlarge this whole beyond the nation state, right? It's not just a whole that is a democratic polity that's circumscribed by national borders or boundaries. He's trying to push beyond and contest the borders and boundaries of democracy. So rather than as separate and isolated minority groups, colonial peoples must be heard as a transnationally connected democratic constituency. These earlier democratic values were unmistakably behind Du Bois's more mature reflections on colonialism in the 1940s. In a 1947 speech delivered on the steps of New York City Hall called Human Rights for All Minorities, Du Bois again utilized the democratic discourse of majority rule to reconstruct democracy on a transnational scale. His conception of a transnational majority created by contesting and reconfiguring the spatial boundaries of democracy, as we see here, hinges fundamentally on his definition of colonialism and colonial status. He says here that Negroes in the United States who are segregated physically and discriminated against spiritually, South American Indians who are laboring peons without rights or privileges, whole laboring classes in Asia and the South Seas who are legally part of imperial countries. All these people occupy what is really a colonial status and make the kernel and substance of the problem of minorities. So again, what we see here is him utilizing the democratic language of majoritarianism to construct transnational anti-colonial solidarities. To make world democracy a reality, colonial peoples would have to develop a sense of themselves as a somewhat unified political constituency. Then rather than a minority nation within a nation, as he put it once, Black Americans would then become part of a transnational majority on a global scale. and this would fundamentally alter the terrain of politics on which civil rights struggles occurred. What we see here also in these kinds of reflections is that Du Bois's democratic transnational project, his new conception of democracy, as he called it, is plagued by a definitional problem. And the question that I asked growing out of this is, how does Du Bois define colonialism in this expansive way that includes all of these different kinds of political forms of domination and exploitation under one sort of rubric or one banner of colonialism or colonial rule? Put slightly differently, how does he construct colonial peoples and colonial status to constitute a transnational democratic constituency that can be represented before the United Nations? What I want to argue here is that Du Bois exploits the conceptual elasticity of words like colonialism and colony in order to build a transnational majority on a global scale. The capaciousness, the fluidity, and the malleability of the term colony allows Du Bois to connect disparate forms of oppression, domination, and exploitation across the boundaries of race, nation, language, and empire. And we see this in one of his first speeches that he gave in his new role with the NAACP in September of 1944, which he delivered in Haiti, ironically, with the financial support of the US State Department. That's another story. But Du Bois immediately begins this speech by noting the fluidity of the term colony. And he signaled that he's going to invest this term with a much wider meaning than is typical in ordinary language. In its conventional meaning, a colony entails a people under the formal economic and political control of a dominant imperial power. That is, very simply, a colony is legally subjugated, legally bound to and under the rule of a foreign government or a foreign power. Yet Du Bois immediately moves beyond this definition in order to include a much broader set of phenomenon dynamics under his definition of colonialism. He says, beyond this narrower definition, there are manifestly groups of people, countries, and nations which will not colonies in the strict sense of the word, yet so approach the colonial status as to merit the designation semi-colonial. As examples of this, Du Bois goes on to cite newly independent states in the Balkans and Eastern Europe, free and independent states in South and Central America, as well as the Caribbean, like Haiti, for instance, as well as even some formerly free African states like Liberia, Ethiopia, or I suppose Abyssinia at the time, and Sierra Leone. Although countries in these regions might enjoy formal political independence, that is, they're not legally subjugated to a foreign power, and they might even enjoy a sense of national unity, their self-determination and their sovereignty is obstructed by their economic dependence on great European powers. And this economic dependence can come through a number of mechanisms. It could be debt, it could be imbalanced or inegalitarian trade relations, it could be reliance on foreign investment. In any case, Du Bois says that these kinds of small or semi-colonial nations are, in a sense, the economic colonies of the owners of a closely knit world of global industry. And to make things more complicated, to this list, Du Bois adds African Americans in the United States, who he says do not form a separate nation, and yet who resemble in their economic and political condition a distinctly colonial status. Just as colonial peoples are disenfranchised, lacking political voice in imperial governments, African Americans also lack any modicum of self-rule. And just as semi-colonial peoples are economically dependent on foreign capital, black communities within the United States are dependent on white capital. Right, so what we see here are these three different kinds of colonies that he's defining here. And I won't kind of spell these out, we've talked about these enough, but the point here is that under this broader rubric of colonialism, there are these three kind of subsets of dynamics, and that's the sort of expansiveness or the capaciousness of this definition that I'm suggesting he engages in to build these kinds of transnational solidarities. And what I want to note here, before moving on really quickly, is that you'll notice that these three different kinds of colony correspond to these earlier three global minority populations. So there's a direct through line between this earlier theory of constructed minorities and these later reflections on colonialism in his work with the United Nations. So Du Bois' specific objective in redefining colonialism and colonial peoples in this much more capacious way reflects a distinct spatial strategy aimed at raising the civil rights struggle from the national to the global scale. And I think we see this most prominently in probably his most famous document or text from the period, and that's an appeal to the world. So the appeal reads as part petition calling on the United Nations to secure human rights for African Americans, and part sociological treatise documenting patterns of racial and legal discrimination. Much of Du Bois's introduction to this document, really his 15-page introduction, rehashes the history of African Americans in the United States. And in some cases, he actually directly paraphrases and reproduces material from his 1935 magnum opus, Black Reconstruction in America. But by the end of his introduction, he begins to present a distinctive analysis of racial domination as a global problem. In appealing to the world rather than to the nation, he embraced an explicit spatial strategy directed at a transnational rather than a strictly national audience. Du Bois rejected the notion here that this petition involved an internal question that was best addressed to the people of the United States, to the nation. Instead, he insisted that race in the US is not a domestic problem, but has direct implications for international order. By breaking out of the confined political space of the nation, which cast racial inequality as a domestic question that was largely divorced from global politics, Du Bois sought to elevate the civil rights struggle by redefining the terrain of politics itself. The one last piece of this that I want to suggest before concluding is the way that Du Bois presents a distinctive theorization of what Kwame Nkrumah in 1965 called NeoColonialism. He coined the term, but I'd suggest here that Du Bois is actually providing the initial analysis of this almost 2 decades before Nkrumah. With world democracy on the horizon, the condition of these semi-colonial countries most forcefully indicated to Du Bois the shape that the new international order promised by the United Nations was going to take. With the end of formal colonialism somewhat in sight, by 1948, India had become independent from the British Empire. Du Bois began to outline the ways in which imperial, if not we might say post-colonial hierarchies, would persist through informal economic dependence. Throughout his work at the United Nations and beyond, this capacious definition of colonialism as comprising both formal colonial and semi-colonial status laid the groundwork for his path-breaking understanding of the United States as, in a sense, an imperial power without formal colonies. He also began to theorize here the United States as a neo-colonial force that expanded through the global spread of purportedly self-regulating markets. As political independence spreads to formerly colonized countries, Du Bois trenchantly prophesized the new forms of imperial domination that would take root here after this post-war global order, and that for him were spurred on by the desire of American capitalists to dominate world markets. Du Bois was one of the first modern American intellectuals to see how US imperialism supersedes, yet nevertheless continues earlier forms of European colonization. So for him, US hegemony in the post-war order represented a distinctively neo-colonial form of imperialism that operates through the imposition of liberal democratic institutions and capitalist economic relations on foreign populations. And we see this in this very succinct quote that he gave here from a 1951 speech on Cold War foreign policy that was delivered to the Boston Community Church, where he says, very simply, colonialism has not disappeared. American business is desperately trying to restore the essentials of colonialism under the name of free enterprise and Western democracy. So Du Bois's anti-imperial thought here profoundly captures the paradoxical or at the least contradictory position of the United States as both an emerging imperial power and as a formally anti-colonial power. Right? What I think he's able to capture here is the way that these new imperial forms, these new neo-colonial imperial forms, represented by the United States, entail these contradictory and simultaneous commitments to both global equality and global white supremacy at the very same time. So in his scholarship and his intellectual activism in the 1940s and the 1950s, Du Bois undertakes nothing less than an attempt to lay the theoretical and practical foundations for a democratic world system. the primary responsibility for redeeming and creating world democracy is not with the US or European empires, but with the political agency of colonized peoples themselves. That is, the crisis in the world system inaugurated by the world wars could only be resolved through anti-colonial solidarity and by radically restructuring the economic and political relations between European imperial powers and colonized populations. I want to conclude here with a quote that Jinjing, in her presentation, I think, was it 2 months ago now, almost, when she presented? Yeah, quite a long time ago. But she talked about this quote that has just stuck with me in a really intriguing and productive way from Du Bois's essay from 1904, The Future of the Negro Race in America. And there Du Bois says that there are, as it seems to me, 4 ways in which the American Negro may develop. First, his present condition of serfdom may be perpetuated. Secondly, his race may die out and become extinct in this land. Thirdly, he may migrate to some foreign land. And fourthly, he may become an American citizen. As I've done this research, and I guess this might even be where I'm asking for some reactions and some help, but as I've done this research, I've become convinced that I don't think it's until the very last years of his life that Du Bois ever entirely loses hope that this 4th option is a distinct possibility. That African Americans might break out of this kind of second-class citizenship status and become full American citizens. I think he starts to lose that hope towards the end of his life, but not until at least the last few years, at least in my reading so far. But what I've also become convinced of is that for Du Bois, becoming American citizens, paradoxically in a sense, required stepping beyond the boundaries of the United States and seeking solidarities with other colonial peoples subject to European imperial rule. So seeking equality within the nation required engaging in a politics of space that would reconstruct, contest, and expand the boundaries of democracy by placing civil rights struggles in their global contexts. The result, I think Du Bois hoped, would be the creation of a transnational constituency of colonial peoples that could be represented at the United Nations, but also that was capable of articulating their own demands for democracy and freedom against European imperial powers. So I'll close there. Thanks. For some reason, as I think about this project, the trifecta of Salvador Dali, Antonio Gramsci, and Du Bois, for some reason, comes together. To me, what I'm interested in, it's this idea of like a new world being born, right? That, like Du Bois is writing at this moment where a new global order is taking root, and he's thinking about it. I just find that so exciting and so profound, right? That he's capturing the new nature of domination that's going to emerge in this new imperial order as it's in the process of being created. So for some reason, something about that, as I was thinking about like images or metaphors to kind of like wrap up what was going on, the Dali painting and the Gramsci quote, which I think is actually apocryphal, but just popped in my head.
It's still good.
I like it either way, yeah. So I'll stop there and open it up for questions.
Come on, I know this question. Comments?
Reactions?
Thank you.
Sure, Adam. First, thanks. This was really wonderful. Really appreciate the work that you did. And putting this all together, and especially laying out these theories of colonialism, and first what would constitute a colony in terms of the political, economic subjugations, externally and internally, and then also like the responses to it. And I'm just wondering too, this is kind of a large question, right? But it might be a really hard question, I'm sorry. But did you see, I see his theorizing of it, but did you see in his writing any way that he thought that, as they say, because they're geographically divided, that's how the subjugation can continue, and so there needs to be a solidarity and a unity. But even if there were a way to create the idea of kind of a transnational solidarity, what did he see as the options for the colonized people to gain more rights? Did he see that through acts of petitioning their government, acts of overthrowing their government, or did he see it more as a labor solidarity? Because I mean, there's always this confluence of race and labor that he's looking at, and I'm just wondering if he, particularly since as we know, he read Marx, a few years prior to when he was starting to write these, and I'm wondering if he may have also read Lenin's essay on colonialism too and imperialism, and I'm wondering with that thought, that was the thought that workers of the world uniting by seizing the means of production and having kind of an economic revolution. Did he put that in as one of the ways he saw that this would happen, or did he think this was going to be political, or did he think this was going to be ideological? Like, what was the means to?
So yeah, that's a great question. So this touches on some other work that I've done on Du Bois, and I think the short answer to your question is that I don't think Du Bois saw internationalist socialism as an option or as a solution. I think he thought that the international working class was too divided by race. The way I put it is that take the concept that he comes up with in Black Reconstruction in America, the notion of the public and the psychological wage, and raise that up to the international and global level. Right. And that divides the working class racially. I mean, I think essentially what he says is that that the international working class gets economic, gets psychological, gets political benefits from colonial domination. Right? So they are not invested in overturning the colonial system. So I think Du Bois would say, hey, in a much more ideal world than this, I mean, the ultimate goal, I think, are those goals of international socialism, but it's not going to come through international working class solidarity in that way. One of the other ways I like to put this, and would answer this kind of question, or at least the way I think about it in my own head, and this comes from one of his unpublished novels, that somebody gave a talk on last year that was really great. I really liked it. It was on A World Search for Democracy, which is this unpublished novel. It was a really great talk, but one of the things that Du Bois says in that is that, so this is actually like just to give you evidence of for people who haven't interacted in this space, like how productive this space is. Like I feel like everything I'm learning about Du Bois is from like these other fellows who are presenting this work. But one of the things that Du Bois says in A World Search for Democracy is he takes to task Marx's idea that workers of the world have nothing to lose but their chains, so unite. What Du Bois essentially responds to that in so many words, what he essentially says to that is that workers of the world, white workers of the world, do in fact have something more to lose than their chains. They have this public or this psychological wage, this status that colonialism positions them up over and above, right? So it's not so simple that as Marx would put it, that the working class is this revolutionary class because they have nothing to lose. And that's somewhat, the Lenin question is tricky. He wrote where a lot of these ideas came from, where his essay on the African roots of the war in 1915, which was before Lenin started writing this stuff on imperialism. So I think he was certainly to some extent influenced by later writings of Lenin, but I would quibble with some people. I think Bill Mullen makes this argument a lot, that he's, Du Bois is basically a Leninist. I think there's more going on than that. I don't think Lenin ever quite captured the complexities of international socialism. So I think Du Bois didn't think international socialism, and that's part of, he's looking for other options beyond international socialism, because that's not going to provide a solution. I think for him, what some of the options were genuinely getting representation at the United Nations. Right? Part of his problem was that colonial peoples didn't have representation. They were represented through their masters. In the same way that slaves were represented, he makes this metaphor, in the same way that slaves were represented in the U.S. Constitution through their masters. They didn't have the right to petition. They didn't have the right to bring claims. So I think at a very simple level, it was providing a venue in which people could bring their claims, their petitions, to a global audience, to a global arena, and have those discussed and debated. But the structure of the United Nations and the dominance of the Security Council at the time didn't allow for this. So it's also an interesting piece of this, which is like, Du Bois in some ways is like actually incredibly reformist at the international level. Like it's not, the battery's dying here, but I don't really need the slides anymore, so sorry.
Yeah, that was, can I just ask kind of a follow-up to that? That was just a great answer to my question. especially when you got towards the end. Yeah, I appreciate that reflection on him, and that's kind of what I was thinking too. I was already assuming he was beyond the idea of a global labor movement, because obviously race is the line that divides that, which he wrote about in Black Reconstruction, and then he sees it internationally. But then when you can reconstruct it on a racial line and kind of unite a colonized people, or have colonial peoples unite, I guess the second part of your answer is more what you're getting to, because the problem that I have with his petitioning kind of the UN, it seems to me that there's this, and the reason I brought up Lenin, right? Lenin and Marx would say that the way the labor gets rights is by claiming the means of production, right? You claim the ownership of it, like you take rights. Rights aren't given to you, they're taken. And in this way, I see a lot of like petitioning, like asking. So I mean, asking the master to give you rights, like doesn't seem like a way to get them. So I'm wondering, like, was he looking at it as I mean, I guess that's a very problematic way to ask it, but I mean, is he advocating asking for recognition at the UN while understanding that this is happening, or was he advocating any kind of a claiming of rights by perhaps claiming land, claiming means of production, ceasing labor, having some kind of strike, having an engagement? Yeah, like an engagement with the state, like a reverse interpolation that would claim power in the area without asking to be recognized.
Yeah, that's a tough question. I mean, I don't know. It's like he looks at Gandhi, right? And it's clearly like admiring of that kind of direct action, right? So I don't want to say that there's no room for direct action, but I do think he thinks that a lot of this can be, or hopes, I should say, that a lot of this can be accomplished by petitioning manifestos. And so that's, I mean, I think that's why I said, there's a kind of reformist element to this. I mean, this isn't a particularly revolutionary program. Although the one thing I would say that is interesting that I have come across and that I'm becoming more and more convinced of is that I think he thinks that these anti-colonial movements are inherently anti-capitalist, and that they will transform economic relations, and that will be a benefit to white workers, right? So white workers, in fact, the white working class will in fact benefit by this kind of anti-colonial action, right? And once they realize that, I think he hopes that there would be this universalism would be possible. So, I mean, that's what I also kind of find interesting about Du Bois too, is that element of it.
Yeah.
Can I just please move that, because I think that years later, when formerly Malcolm X, but El Hajj Malik al-Shabazz goes to the UN, it's not necessarily to ask in the same way, but it's actually to cause the United States to be on a global stage and admit what they've done.
Yeah.
And because we are quick, we as in the United States, are quick to force countries to recognize human rights violations. And so Jim Crow, lynching, all of these kinds of, the terror and violence against African Americans was not being talked about on the global stage. And there are human rights violations, but you have to actually bring it to the UN, which is in the United States. So So you want to shift the conversation. I just wanted to bring up
I think that's a really great point. So I think that is, one way of interpreting this is that it's a kind of petition or asking for, and that kind of feels a little bit milquetoast to us or something like that, right? But I think what you're saying is correct, and I should qualify my response to that I think bringing those petitions to the United Nations is in some ways a quite radical and almost insurgent act. And you see that Malcolm X was not asking anybody to recognize his rights. He was trying to use humiliation. He was trying to expose the contradiction of this imperial power regulating human rights in every other country, yet violating human rights at home, right?
And then he was dead.
And then he was dead, yeah. But that's also, so that was a great qualification.
Yes, that is like a forcing recognition.
Yeah. So I think
I was just wondering what the timing was of, so Ida B. Wells is going to the UK, or not the UK then, Great Britain, and successfully publicly shaming the US to address lynching more effectively than she ever could in the US. So is Du Bois's going after she did that, or are they roughly at the same time?
I don't know, do you know when that was? Or
You probably know.
when Ida B. Wells went to the UK? I'm not sure. I mean, so I haven't looked into that, but that's like kind of really interesting to me, that idea of sort of like putting pressure, claiming rights within the nation by trying to go and shame the nation abroad, right?
It was very effective because the South would say, well, we're not doing that, or no, we don't advocate for that. And so because they were on the spot, they had to then, start practicing what they were saying. But Alice Paul was going to the Great Britain and getting very progressive, somewhat revolutionary methods for addressing suffrage. So there seems to be efforts to go to the international stage because the domestic stage is not working. So I'm just wondering where that all fits in.
I don't know that much about that, but that's certainly stuff that I'll look in, because I think that's like kind of very broadly what I'm interested in, these sorts of transatlantic conversations that are going on.
And Ida B. Wells and Du Bois were co-founders of the NAACP, so they're,
Yeah, I would look into that. That's great. I mean, I think I don't know about Ida B. Wells. I will certainly look into it. The one thing that pops into my head also, that as you were talking about it, is that this goes way back to, I think, of like Frederick Douglass going to Ireland and doing these lectures in the UK and doing the same thing, right? Sort of like trying to provoke ridicule and humiliation from foreign nations, right? And so I'm interested in that as a kind of strategy of agitation, right? For rights. So I will look into that. I did not know that about Ida B. Wells, so I will certainly look into that thing.
According to Science Directives, 1893 to 1894.
Is when she went to the UK? Yeah, so...
The documentary about her life, Passion for Justice, is wonderful.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a great suggestion.
And the Great Britain-U.S. linkages for suffrage, if you look at One Woman, One Vote, that documentary spells out a lot.
Okay. Yeah, no, those are great suggestions. And then go ahead.
Me? So, thank you. It was great, and I missed the first few minutes. I apologize for that. So you may have addressed this at the beginning, but to what extent was he worried about, or did he make suggestions for how to deal with the fact that the colonial people, as he was defining them around the world, transnational groups, were divided by cultural differences that existed outside of the colonial network, so linguistic differences, and did he have a kind of suggestion for how that might be dealt with in trying to present a unified front?
That's a good question. I'd have to look back at that, but that's a really great, now that you mention it, seems like a very obvious question that I don't know that I have an answer to. Let me think. I'm trying to think of like clear religious differences, right? Or something like that, or linguistic differences. I mean, I don't know that he does actually have a clear answer to this, because again, I think the other kind of contradictory thing about this is that it's still, as you mentioned, the United Nations is in the United States. Its business is conducted in English. And so there's still a kind of even in internationalism, there's still a kind of Americocentrism to it, right? And I think Du Bois is a part of that. I mean, as I was thinking about your I feel like I'm always punting these really great questions because I don't know how to answer them, but I'm kind of thinking of, for instance, Martin Luther King Jr., who in his own internationalism tried to clearly think about continuities between Islam and Judaism and Christianity and try to overcome those sorts of religious differences to instill a broader internationalism. And I don't know that I've ever quite seen anything like that with Du Bois and an equivalent effort. But it's
maybe he just didn't think it was a problem.
I think some of this is for him is I think it's a question of, okay, what's going to motivate people to action? And I think for him it might be the problem of overcoming colonial domination is enough for people to perhaps overcome those kinds of religious, racial, ethnic differences that they might have that are not reducible to the colonial relation or the colonial network. And that might be somewhat of a faulty assumption on his part, that it's opposition to that which oppresses, which is enough to instill a sense of solidarity and action. So sorry that I don't have a better answer to that question. I think it's a great question, and I will have to think about it more and look for it more in my research, so thanks. Then you had a question.
I just, first of all, it was fantastic. It was eye-opening. I have two questions. The first question is probably more of maybe you speculating, maybe not. I think of places like Tulsa, Oklahoma, where they were, according to probably your talk, they were basically thriving in a capitalist society, and and then it was basically burnt down. And I guess my first question would be, what, if anything, was there any anger that people weren't trying to sort of go outside of the United States and make a bigger difference and just sort of settled for, building up within this sort of capitalist society by the Bois, or was it something he maybe didn't even think about? The only reason that came up is because, when he did the three sort of links, I'm like, there are people at one point in time in more than one place that were Negroes that were thriving, and that was in the 20s, I believe. Yeah. And that was the dream. Own your own businesses. Populate your own sort of agriculture. But then on the other side, if he believed we need to we need to sort of fix the world so it can be not fix the world, but fix globally for it to be a more stronger sense of the United States. Does that bring any schisms that you know of, or does it make any sense?
No, it does. I'm not sure that there's anything off the top of my head. I mean, I think that's a question unto itself, like what Du Bois thought or wrote about the terrorism of Tulsa, right? Yeah, I mean that's a really intriguing question, because that was, it was almost like a kind of black capitalism.
Right, it was.
For him, right.
It was the whole point of, that sort of second-class citizen doing, what the oppressor was, but they were doing it themselves. And I think, as someone who was, trying to sort of tap into and unite globally, how would someone feel about that? What would be the, how can you rationalize that?
I don't know. I mean, one way to think, so this is complete, you're right. So I think I see the question now. So I think it's in its complete speculation, right, on my part. But within this framework, one could see Du Bois perhaps saying that what was the neighborhood in Tulsa called again? Greenwood, yeah. What the people in Greenwood were essentially accomplishing were something like this, a separate national existence, right? And that what that shows, what the failure of that shows, is, and this is another good example, right? How does, and this is after the League of Nations, so how does a country talking about human rights or peace and prosperity and all this stuff have that, right? And that might be precisely the problem, that by seeking a separate national existence, one is kind of segregated from within the nation and doesn't have necessarily access to these broader global arenas. And so one could perhaps see Du Bois saying, that's precisely the problem, right? Is having these tactics and strategies for social uplift that ignore the fact that colonialism is worldwide, and racism and white supremacy are global systems, right? And so I don't, it's hard to speculate as to what he would say, but if I were to stay within a Du Boisian framework, at least the framework that I put out here, that might be one response to that kind of shows the need for this new conception of democracy, right? Because black folk in Greenwood were not going to be able to have that kind of wealth.
For certain people's watch. The second question I have is about all the statistics that he sent to the, where did he get that from? How was he able to get that information?
Yeah. Well, he's getting it from some people. He's writing letters to people, and they're giving it to him. Some of it might be colonial records. I mean, the British Empire kept meticulous colonial records. You can go to the British Library and see those still, right? So and he says that these are estimates, right? And this is what he's saying. You know, this adds up to about 750 million, which at the time was a third of the world's population. Probably much larger than that, in fact.
And would some of this have filtered from like Pan-African conferences?
Yeah, probably that's a good question, right? Yeah, I think that's a good point actually, because he is doing this all building on his previous, 3 or 4 decades of organizing these Pan-African conferences. I think this thing is a different thing than the Pan-African conferences. It's a different audience and a different set of conversations, but he clearly had these global connections where he would have been able to get access to this data. I mean, I think that where would he have get that? Well, one thing to note is that this is what he was being paid by the NAACP to do, was to precisely find this kind of information, right? Because they just don't know this at the time, right? So what the NAACP is saying is, like, if we're going to go and represent a kind of global colonial population, we need to have this information, right? So that was like his job, was to get these. But I'll look a little bit more into where he would have gone. But I think you're right. Pan-African, and he was very. We know in the 1919 and early 20s conferences, he was really plugged into the French anti-colonial movement. So he had these pretty thick connections with other anti-colonial groups.
So what is saying all this? I keep Fanon is just and I know it's about the psychology of the colonized subject or the colonized, and the idea of more wretched of the earth than black skin, white masks. But I wonder, are they writing in parallel? I mean, I know Fanon doesn't. The Wretched Earth is 61, so it's rather late.
He references Du Bois in Wretched of the Earth. So he's reading it.
Yeah,
but he wrote it quick because he had to get it out before he died. So I'm just wondering what the.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean,
because how can you be that across boundaries, right? The colonized are so understanding of their local, of the situation that they're in, right? And then violence becomes the only means for which freedom can come, and then other things happen after that. But it's difficult to, the constant inability to be able to take that energy and then look outside to bring in has been the work of the colonizer. So we can't, it's almost impossible for us to reach our hands across, even though it would give us strength. And because I also think about the use of global majority, which we are, but yet it's hard, that reaching out, and that's why I went back to read The Wretched Earth, because I was like, that violence, I forgot about that element, which it separates in ways that is still kind of the afterlife of colonialism.
And it alienates one from oneself, right?
Yes.
That separation, right? I mean, that might be, and I've always had, so like most people, my entry point into this stuff is Fanon. Right? So Fanon is always in the back of my mind in everything I read in this. And so I think what you're pointing out to me, which would be productive to play around with more, is that I think Fanon is actually posing a challenge to this kind of program in a really profound way, which is that this overcoming of this inferiority complex, as he call it, this kind of epidermalization of inferiority, is a national project, right? And it has to be. But then there is an internationalism in Fanon, right? So he says you kind of have to have the national element first, and then it is moving beyond to an internationalism. If you just leave it at the national level, he's afraid that the national bourgeoisie is just going to step in and gain control of the revolution, right? So, but I think that what is lacking in this analysis of Du Bois is the psychological violence of colonization, and how that might fracture the possibilities of global anti-colonial solidarity, right? And it's sort of ironic, that a lot of people oftentimes read Fanon alongside the notion of double consciousness, right? Yeah.
Wow.
that seemingly that psychological thing that you get, that psychological focus that you get in Souls is, I think, a little not as present in this later stuff.
I think there's a lot of parallels between Black Skins, White Mask and double consciousness, and I think Fanon even talks about double consciousness, if I remember correctly. And even just the wretched of the earth, to me, reads kind of like a longer version of the Du Bois' Roots of War. The fury of the destruction of the colonial project. But I think another kind of interesting ripple in talking about Marxism is, just as Du Bois doesn't seem to be thinking that international Marxism is going to save us, Fanon talks about how, like what you implied, Marxism just doesn't work in colonial societies because the people who are tapped by the colonizer, the people who are the native people who are tapped by them, are not going to be, they're not revolutionary at all. The uprisings would be more in the countryside, not the people in the city were the ones that were given special privileges, and so they're the opposite of the bourgeoisie that's going to become revolutionary and rise up. They're not, and so Marxism doesn't work in the colonial context. Because they've created, because colonialism has created this tier of native people who were privileged under colonialism, who then take control of the means of production and will not. They're not going to revolt.
Yeah, and Du Bois does in fact talk about some of this. I mean, like I've presented a very broad overview of this, but a lot of these writings are actually him talking about the very minute particularities and details of colonial governments, right? And a lot of this is about precisely what you're talking about, the way that sort of informal colonial rule relies on native elites. Right. And then integrates them into the colonial structure, and then when that colonial structure vanishes, then those elites are there and are not reproducing exactly, but in some cases the same colonial hierarchies that they were ruling under. They just got the imperial masters out of the way. So I think that some of that is actually in Du Bois in key respects. I think the one thing as we're talking that also jumped out to me that I want to be a little hesitant in saying is, I'm not sure how concerned Du Bois is with mass action in this moment, right? Which is ironic because in 1935 with the general strike, of course, that was the whole point. But I'm not sure that he's really theorizing the action of the masses at this point in the way that Fanon is, right? That's kind of Fanon's whole thing, right?
He's fighting.
He's fighting, right? Yeah. I mean, in this moment, there's an elitism to this, right? This is in the upper halls of global governance, right? And I think that's not to discount it, but I think that's just to say that's one important difference I think between Fanon and a lot of others is that he's. I mean, just to give you one example, this is just absolutely crazy to me. He sends a letter to, when is it? It was right after the United Nations conference. This picture is where this is from. He's testifying before the House Committee on Foreign Intelligence. He sends a letter to the chair, I can't remember the senator who was the chair at the time. He sends a letter to the chair of that committee asking if he can testify before the committee, asked for 15 minutes to testify before a Senate committee. Gets a letter 2 or 3 days back granting him that 15 minutes to testify before the Senate Foreign Intelligence Committee, right? That just gives you a sense of like this sort of, and then he got like a really nasty letter from Walter White basically chastising him for going outside of the boundaries of the NAACP channels and without approval of the board basically. But that just kind of gives you a sense of like, you know, he's in the halls of power at this moment in a lot of ways.
Did he go as a representative of the NAACP, or was he going independently?
As the to the Senate Foreign Intelligence briefing, he was going. I think he saw himself as a representative of the NAACP. I don't think Walter White and the board didn't think that because they didn't give him authorization to do that. But he saw himself going in his role as the NAACP.
That's why I asked if he went as a representative, because he would have to get permission from the board.
Yeah, he did. And
if he was going as an independent.
Why would the board not like him going to, why would the board celebrate
because I think
this?
they said the letter, I think, was that they had a specific strategy, and I think they went over his head. I'd have to look into exactly what
It's
it was.
also funding.
Oh, yeah. The other thing about this from this period
They
is,
thought it would cut funding.
like, one could rewrite, I thought about this, like, one could rewrite Du Bois's career in the 1940s as like a Kafka novel, like him basically trying to get paid. Most of his correspondence with the NAACP is him trying to get money and get reimbursed for his expenses and to get office space. Like, that's most of the correspondence. It's funny but sad.
And this is actually a rare photo because he never shows his hands.
Oh, really?
Because he has vitiligo. So he always hid his hands as he got older. That's just a Du Bois fact. I guess you all didn't know that.
No, I didn't know that.
As a child, he got lots
So
of
he always has his hands either behind him or in pockets.
What was the accident that happened?
No, it's vitiligo, where your skin changes color.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you totally see it. Now that you point it out.
But he was very self-conscious about it.
That's where I was.
I wouldn't have noticed that. I don't think I ever noticed that, right? Like, and I wouldn't if he didn't show me that.
And in that one too, yeah, totally see it. I never saw it before.
Huh. Now in all the photos I'm going to be...
I'm sorry, fun Du Bois fact. That's I think I'd love to say thank you all for coming, and let's give